Nick, who wants to talk about how veganism is consistent with secular morality. And I have taken your call because I'm not afraid of how pissed off the internet is going to be at me for not being a vegan and for already mentioning a cheeseburger. How are you doing today, Nick?
Oh, pretty good. It was good to hear, I guess, like the previous call, because, I mean, I guess that kind of segues like super nicely into everything, related to, I mean, I don't know if you want to like put it this way, but I feel like we're sort of buying ourselves a lot of really silly lottery tickets to, SARS, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, even flu.
I was just going to say, like, not silly lottery tickets. They're a bad investment. Don't do it. Sorry, that's just from me. So you're sidling into veganism in terms of beef and the flesh of other beasts that we consume being a better vector for disease than plant life?
Oh, I mean, like, it's like unquestionable. I mean, there's no doubt that you have all of these diseases. It's always a farm with chickens that bird flu, swine flu. No question about that. Someone actually challenged me on that recently, and then I looked it up. I was like, oh, wow. Like, also, like, MRSA. Like, I didn't even realize that, like, antibiotic-resistant bacteria come from...
You don't get a plague or a pandemic, like even the Black Death, until you have unsafe health conditions and a large number of animals that can be disease vectors around a large human population, right? Like, the things that become pandemics and kill us, because diseases don't evolve and last a long time. They're not well suited to their environment if they do immediately kill the beasts that they end up growing in, right? Like smallpox and even COVID-19 are things that we've got from animals that we eat, right? In the animals that they developed in, they developed to not be deadly, to not be lethal, to not kill the thing that houses them. But then they spread and they jump species, which happens very rarely, but when it does happen, it's very dangerous because the things that they do to survive, depending on whether it's a virus or not, in another animal, they replicate and do in a human, and it usually makes us sick and die. So in terms of, for example, pig meat being a very good vector for disease, as well as a very good topping on a cheeseburger, I'm right there with you on both counts. Although, admittedly, I'm not trying to slip that one in on there either. I'm jumping to the conclusion that perhaps you're a vegan and didn't have a double cheeseburger today. Is that fair to say?
No. Yeah, I'm definitely a vegan. Did not have a double cheeseburger.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say
there's no judgment if you have a cheat day. Yeah.
I'm just going to jump straight ahead of this and say that, yes, veganism is the morally superior position. It has many health benefits. I will absolutely agree with that, and I will take the position that I am in the morally inferior position and the health inferior position as a meat eater. I am trying to cut down the amount of red meat I eat and the amount of dairy I consume, but that's more out of a health concern rather than a morality concern. I would eat lab-grown meat if it was available to me, or other protein sources from insects and the like. But I'm not going to argue that it's not the more superior position morally.
I guess
I have a slightly different slice of it. I've spent less time going into the specific details in terms of where you define the difference in terms of species and kingdom, but I just have to say, because we're sitting next to each other and hosting the same show, that I'm less there with you in terms of it being a morally superior position.
And that's fascinating.
Yeah, we'll have our duel after the show. I think we've got a couple broadswords back there. I was gonna say we've been talking about having a sword fight for a while. But it's good. So one of the things that I was interested in, I mean, sure, there's definitely health benefits, and if you can apply any general rule across the population for health, it's better to eat mostly plants. And then even before you get into vectors for disease. But what you said here is that it's consistent with secular morality. And so far, the main points that we've touched on are health-related, probably because we were just talking about vaccines on the previous call. Did you want to touch more on the moral aspect of your veganist position? If that's not too aggressive to say, you veganist, bringing your veganism in here while I'm thinking about cheeseburgers.
Yeah, I guess, so that's the problem with like any sort of like health or like large population argument is that like, even if you were to like, let's say argue like, with like the disease vector argument, what I've found is the problem with that is human nature. So if you say, like, let's say I could conclusively prove that we need to cut our meat consumption by 99%, then every single person is going to say, great, I'll do nothing. And then 99 people will take action for me, So,
the free rider effect.
Yeah, so it's sort of like not really a particularly like convincing position. I guess like the thing that I would challenge on like in terms of like the morality where you say like, oh well, it's like a morally I would eat lab grown meat if it were possible, is sort of like that we don't accept that for any other like moral position that we would take. So for instance, if you think that dog fighting is immoral, you wouldn't say like, well, I'm waiting for VR dog fighting with smell-o-vision to get super realistic, and then I'll stop dog fighting. Or you say like,
smell-o-vision is you made me wrinkle my nose. Yeah.
But I have thoughts on virtual representations of otherwise objectionable things, because you're getting into the realm of, well, what about war games? What about virtual murder? What about this? What about that? I've done many, many war crimes on computers. So many.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't see myself as an immoral person because I have witnessed and interacted with a virtual representation of a reprehensible act. And the thing is, with secular morality, I've always felt, and feel free to slap me across the back of the head and correct me if I'm wrong, it's relative, and we make judgments based on circumstance and context, because, yes, maybe it is the morally superior thing overall to not eat meat, but if you're starving and all you have is that cheeseburger, well, I'm going to let you eat that damn cheeseburger.
I was going to say, you're going to have a hard time stopping me. Sorry, I keep bringing up cheeseburgers because usually if I host a show... if I host a show, I have one before the show because it's the right amount of nutrients and food to carry me through the show without getting hungry. But now it's on the brain, and I know exactly how far the nearest place that serves one is. But yeah, in terms of the virtual display of things that, if they were real, would be immoral, I think it touches on an aspect of morality that's most important to remember. And I'm not strictly just a consequentialist, morally speaking, or philosophically speaking, but I think that if you're not considering the consequences of an action in terms of its morality, that you're really missing a key point. And in terms of I'm playing a war game and committing as many... I didn't come in today expecting to hear my co-host admit to committing war crimes. I'll admit to being surprised by that. But in terms of playing video games, etc., something might turn someone's stomach, but it's important to separate that from the actual consequences of one's actions. So I will say, the other thing that surprises me is that we haven't talked about the conditions of animals in factory farms, which is where I usually expect people that are talking about the morality of veganism to go. I'm sorry, I think I cut you off there, though, on what you were trying to say.
Oh, yeah. So I wasn't trying to say anything about like the morality of, let's say, doing stuff in VR or whatever. What I was trying to say about like was that lab-grown meat, like saying something along the lines of like, well, I think that it's morally superior to not eat meat. I'm waiting around for lab-grown meat. I'm just saying that like in any other context, you wouldn't accept that argument if for anything else that was like immoral.
I do.
You wouldn't accept the argument that like, oh, I'm waiting for like some, like alternate form of something that's immoral to happen before, you would just say, well, okay, well, that doesn't make an action moral. Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
I'm not sure that I do. Are you saying that you're going to have to run that one by me, because what it sounded like you were saying was that if something was immoral, you wouldn't be waiting for the simulated version of it. Run that one by me one more time. I think the phrasing threw me off.
No, that's exactly it. Like if something's immoral, it's not a good defense of it to say like, well, I'm waiting for like some alternate simulation of that immoral thing.
Well, why not? I mean, what is the immorality in eating meat? It's the taking of the animal's life or exploiting the animal as a free creature and that kind of thing. I understand that. But cells in a petri dish in a lab have no consciousness, have no freedom.
Sure.
They are biomass.
Yeah.
And there is no moral objection to eating that, even if it is the same cells. Like, I might be a little bit squicked out, but if someone said, yeah, we made lab-grown meat, it's human meat, would you like to try it? I'm like, for the lols, maybe, I don't know. But I wouldn't find it morally objectionable because it's just cells in a petri dish. It came from nothing. It doesn't have a consciousness. It isn't at all going to harm anyone for me to interact with that in any way. So what is actually the problem?
Sorry. Sorry. I think you might be misunderstanding me again.
You're saying you wouldn't continue to engage in the action while waiting for it, for the simulated version. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
that makes much more sense. You're saying if Jamie here believed that it was immoral, he wouldn't continue eating meat and then say, okay, well, I'll wait to stop eating meat until I can eat meat that is moral.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, no. Yeah. The ideal position would be, of course, I would stop eating meat right now and then be able to start be enjoying my lab-grown cheeseburgers. You've got me infected with cheeseburgers.
Well, if you were going to get infected with something, cheeseburgers are a good infection to have. You should have gotten a cheeseburger vaccine. Although, actually, that's just a joke. Please do not inject cheeseburger into your veins. Don't do it.
We're going into secular because that's beef.
I think that...
Oh, yeah. Sorry. What were you saying, Tim?
Yeah, go ahead.
Or, I'm sorry, Nick?
Oh, yeah. So I was going to say, so in terms of okay, well, one might say then okay, well, it would then be left to, sort of to the vegans to demonstrate that somehow there is something unethical about eating animal products, even if they were quote unquote, I don't know, humanely slaughtered, to use that phrase. And you brought up factory farming, which is just an excellent point, because there's this thing that I used to do, and I think a lot of vegans, it's like this assumption that we sort of implicitly accept, which is that, it sort of strengthens the argument to say that, if you have an animal and you raised it ethically, and then you had sort of all good days and then one bad day sort of a thing, that would somehow strengthen the position of eating meat. In fact, I think it's the opposite. And I haven't really heard many people talk about it in terms of this way. In fact, it makes your argument way worse, because what it means then is it draws a really contorted lasso around the sorts of things that you might think are ethical and unethical. So you could sort of imagine, okay, you could sort of get into things where people sort of give you funny looks, what about eating mentally handicapped humans, cutting the fins off of a dolphin and throwing it back in the water to drown, all these sorts of things where people are okay, you start to sound pretty psychotic. And then you say, okay, great. Well, what about for instance, torturing, beating an animal? Okay, no, but somehow, so we agree that it's in all these cases, unethical to harm a being that has subjective experience. Yeah, we make this weird exception. And so the problem with something like special pleading is that it's saying that you're making a distinction with no justification. So in fact, there's no way for me to prove that there's no justification for this. One would have to ask for justification and have the person show up empty-handed. And so that's sort of the thing, is that in fact, it's the burden of proof would be to show that justification for making that exception.
Well, again, get ready with the head smack here, Jamie. That's why a lot of us, a lot of people in the secular community say that it's that secular humanism is the flourishing of human well-being specifically, and whether that supersedes animal well-being. Again, we are talking about into a more ethical thing, but when it comes to secular morality, it depends who you ask a little bit. But yeah, human flourishing is often the phrase that I've heard.
Yeah. And then I think I'm going to find that my position deviates somewhat from the mainstream here, because there's this general assumption about applying moral value directly to pain and suffering, and I see this issue from a very different perspective. There's this idea that moral rightness and the proper way to act is dependent on or a direct reflection of abstract ideas abstracted from the nature of human beings and all of the matter and energy that's fluctuating through the quantum field that we exist in. And one of the problems that I've found in my philosophical ruminations on moral philosophy, he said self-aggrandizingly, is that perspective I just find significantly less persuasive now. So assumptions that people have, and as far as they take them, like harm is bad. Okay, but to me, that's a very, very, very flimsy place to start in terms of we're going to start here and then we're going to go from there in terms of determining what the proper way for human beings to interact with everything around us. Right, we have a different consideration for what it is morally correct for me to do when I interact with a rock, than when I interact with a tree, then when I interact with a cow, than when I interact with a fellow human being, right? And you have to. The problem that I have when people try to lay out the moral arguments about harm to animals, which, to be clear, before I start sounding too psychotic, I don't. It's not an end goal to seek, but there's this special perspective that I hear in the arguments offered to human beings that isn't given to the actions of other animals. To some degree, human beings acting for their survival and in their own instinct, I put in the same context as a snake poisoning a mouse before it eats it, or a mound of incredibly aggressive ants consuming something to death. And so in terms of understanding that there is no real distinction between me and the rest of nature, simply because I live in this wonderful lollipop, candy cane, plastic world that we've constructed for ourselves, that I'm a really big fan of, because among other things, it means I can eat it means that I am capable, from where I am in the United States, of eating almost as many cheeseburgers as I want. From that to modern medicine, etc., sure, it gives me this situation and this perspective that's entirely detached from nature, that's entirely detached from my natural environment. Like an orca in an aquarium, nothing about my life has anything to do, really, with what it is to be a human naturally, except for my interaction with other humans. And so trying to start from there and build an argument is basically where I am in terms of my view of how these things go. So when we get to things like factory farms, yes, it gets very complicated, but one of the places that I look is to ants in particular, because among the animal kingdom, in some ways, I find the behavior of ants more similar to the behavior of human societies than anything else. They're a species that has mastered a form of communication. It's chemical, and ours is better. Verbal communication, I find. Look around you. We can pass on knowledge 3 generations down, and ants can't do that. But in terms of the way that we behave socially, or the way that human societies interact with their environment, and the way that ant colonies interact with their environment, there's a lot of similarities. So when you get slaver ants or ants that farm, I look to that in terms of a perspective of how much harm, how much damage, how much destruction is justified when a living thing or a collection of living things is interacting with the environment around it. So even before we get to, is this causing harm? Well, the shortcut that people take is human flourishing, human harm. But we do still care. Even people that will say, no, it's human flourishing, etc., they're not out murdering dogs just for fun.
No.
So it's a question that I think gives us the opportunity to ask a deeper question about what we mean by harm and what we mean by morality. Because until recently, as best I can tell philosophically, applying morality to the interactions between humans and non-humans is new.
I guess I don't understand how that would, like any of this would sort of draw the distinctions that you're interested in between, like, for instance, saying that all the other things I listed that are unethical, and yet making that exception for eating animals.
Well, let me ask you this, just sorry to just quickly interject. Do you believe that our ability to argue the merits of secular morality are damaged by the fact that we eat meat?
That relies a little bit on a semantic overload. So in the one sense, obviously you could, the fact that somebody is eating meat, like in principle wouldn't stop them from articulating, for instance, arguments against a prime mover, So in that sense, no. I do think that it's a highly self-inconsistent position. And I think, in fact, I'll go ahead and say this. I think that you'll find, so like if you go outside and you touch grass, which is, for some people, might be a tall ask, what you'll find is that people would, like, when I tell people like that I'm a vegan and that I've been a vegan for like close to a decade now, people are interested in talking to me about that. And they would rather listen to the business end of a nail gun than have me talk about my atheism. So it's definitely like you just get way more bite on that, no questions asked. And I think that it's not an unreasonable thing to say, like, look, well, I mean, it's sort of, I think when you go out, so you get like a lot of these types of same arguments. So essentially what you get is arguments that are something along the lines of like, that just try to introduce general sloshiness into morality. And so you'll get things like, like this whole like idea about like nature and stuff like that. The truth is we just simply don't accept, we just agree that that's a bad argument for everything else that we say that we decide is immoral, right? We agree that slavery is immoral and yet ants enslave each other, and cannibalism's immoral, even though plenty of species, including even up to chimps, cannibalize. So, we just quite simply don't accept any of that argument. We don't say like, well, Jeffrey Dahmer, let me defend him real quick. When we look out and we see ants, and we really see chimps cannibalize each other, can we really say, that this was something wrong? Or like, is it the same thing with like this idea of like, to say like, well, my morality is based on humanism wouldn't actually be a defense of the special pleading. It would just simply be restating it. It's just simply saying, well, human because human. Okay, that doesn't necessarily really enlighten us. So none of those arguments are good. And the problem with arguing with that is you would already agree with me in literally any other context. And so I do think that in fact you do get a lot of bite. You just get you get a lot
more bite that way.
There's this idea.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I would say just there are a couple of points that you said even just now that I disagree with. My problem with what Jeffrey Dahmer did. Well, okay, there's a stomach turning, etc., but is a violation of the other people's will. When I die, if science has no need of my body, the concept, just philosophically, of providing sustenance, and then, it's a little bit almost regressive sounding, but of providing sustenance to my friends and family in the form of being a meal is not morally reprehensible to me. In fact, it's poetic. So in terms of cannibalism specifically, I don't see the moral issue there. I just see the issue of the violation of human will, right? Obviously, eating someone against their will is wrong, but it's the will and not the eating that I have a problem with. The violation of the human will that I have a problem with.
And you say special pleading, but you can call me a speciesist, but I'm always going to side with the human over the animal in most circumstances. The burning building, there's a puppy and a baby. I'm going to say the baby. There's a puppy and a old woman who's 10 days away from dying of stage 4 cancer. I'm still going to say the old woman. So, I'm speciesist.
Yeah. I agree with you, yeah.
It's not going to stop you from throwing a tennis ball out the window. Yeah. Hopefully the puppy follows it as you save the old woman. Mm-hmm. Just trying to throw a little bit of a creative wrench into the next version of Philippa Foot's contribution to morality there.
Right, but the idea that so again, you don't accept that argument. So like if you talk about, okay, let's say there's like an old person that's 10 seconds away from death in a burning building and an infant, of course you would save the infant. But you wouldn't accept that same argument that you just used against animals against killing old people in general, So again, it's
of course not. Those are entirely different. It's an entirely different moral question in terms of causing a death that otherwise wouldn't have happened and preventing a death, 10 seconds before something else. But there's lots of things of value to humanity that you can throw in there that I find that are more complicated. So, for example, like the only existing copy of a person's will, right? Which I don't know why people haven't used this as a question as well, in a burning building, and a person who's 10 seconds away from cancer. That's a tricky moral question for me, because one of these two things represents a human being's last will and testament. And so for me, it's a lot about consciousness and human will, although I don't say that because I can't define at what point a person becomes conscious, because even a person who's in a vegetative state with no hope of recovery with modern medicine, I still think of and still say, okay, well, my morality would seem incomplete if I didn't consider this person. And they're, I've taken to philosophically using the words soul and spirit, but I can't do that here because it has a very different context on an atheist show.
It doesn't matter. I mean, that's focusing on the details. If it's still like a 10-year-old and an 80-year-old, let's say.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
if you could only save one. Yeah. It's not an argument for massacring 80-year-olds. So saying that
that's true.
Save both of those over a pig is not an argument for massacring a pig. So again, all these arguments that we just quite simply don't accept. Like it
well stated.
That distinction.
Yeah, that's a very well stated argument, actually, in terms of the comparative value of two things versus the absolute value of whether or not it's right to slaughter them for food. Which I'm also not saying. I've never eaten a human, so there's that as well. There's some concerned looks in the audience after I started talking about cannibalism. So I just want to clarify. When I talk about how I'm hungry for a cheeseburger, I don't mean you. In any case, this has been a very interesting call. I wish that I was coming back next week and could ask you to call in again.